Hi, everyone. I'm Lloyd Gom. I'm VP Marketing and Business Development for Delta Q, which is part of the Zappi Group of companies. I'd like to welcome you to our keynote.
Hello and welcome. I'm Claes Avarsjö, Executive Director of Zappi Group. Our goal for this conference is to provide original equipment manufacturers with a variety of thought leadership presentations and panel discussions to help provide perspectives, vehicle application context, and subsystem recommendations to help you think about your own electrification strategies and objectives.
So I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Saul Griffith. He's our keynote for our conference, and he's highly anticipated. We're really excited to have him to chat with us. I'd like to point out that Saul is a trooper. He's been it's had COVID for 10 days. It's been a bit tough, but he quipped that thank God for vaccines. So he's he's doing okay, but he is sick. But we thank you, Saul, for joining us. Saul is an inventor, author, and founder of multiple companies and nonprofits. These range from NASA, DARPA, National Science Foundation, and more. He has founded and co-founded multiple successful companies. Some have been acquired that he started, and he's won a variety of awards. And in terms of books, the book that we've been passing around at Delta Q and recommending people read is Electrify, an Optimist Playbook for our clean energy future. So again, thank you, Saul. We really appreciate having you for the event. And I'll let you take it away.
Terrific. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Lloyd. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Now, I'll share the screen. There'll be a nervous moment where hopefully someone will confirm they're seeing a yellow Rewiring America logo.
I see it.
And hopefully
and while you're doing that, I'll just remind the audience that you can add questions to the Q&A on your right. And at the end, we'll have Saul engage with us on some questions.
Terrific. And if I'm really off track, don't, shout in all capitals in the question time, and I'll see if I can answer it midstream. I'm Saul Griffith. I'm going to be talking about rewiring America, or in fact, rewiring the world. By way of introduction, my day job looks much more like, I suspect, a lot of the day jobs of the people on this call. An engineer and a company founder, and I've built multiple technology companies, the majority in the electrification and clean energy space. In fact, building my second wind energy company right now, an new offshore technology. We're onto our third solar company, and we're doing two new technologies in electric heating and cooling, and even in micro mobility. So not as much as all of you, but I've spent enough time specifying electric motors and drives and battery management systems and all of the like. That's my day job, and I've done well enough that my wife has allowed me to take a couple of years off to work on climate policy. And the slide here, Rewiring America, actually speaks to that. I founded an organization a couple of years ago with a friend, Alex Lasky. He's also an entrepreneur in the energy space. And we founded Rewiring America to help households in the climate transition, in this big energy transition that we're going through. We work actively on writing policy and have been helping the White House on electrification and energy policy. And we are active in sort of putting into the conversation all of the machines on the demand side. And one of the unique things we bring to the climate conversation is really the understanding of the machines underneath. And I will be giving you that talk today. And in fact, some of these slides come from a talk I gave to the new Electrification caucus in the US Senate, which is organized around making America a leader in the electrification of everything. So here we go with the slides. Oh, there you go. That's the Electrify, the Optimist Playbook for our clean energy future. I published that 2 years ago. I've since also published a second book called The Big Switch. I relocated to Australia during COVID, and while maintaining all of that work in the US, I've actually also started an organization called Rewiring Australia, basically working on the same types of things in Australia. So here we go. This is the case for electrifying everything. So many of you might have read the news this morning about the IPCC's new assessment on climate. It's a fairly grim report, and maybe you're a little bit aware, but this is sort of climate for energy nerds. The carbon crisis really is an energy crisis at heart. In fact, in the US, 87% of our emissions are from energy. It's how we use coal, natural gas, and oil to supply all of our fuels. The remainder, for those who are interested, are basically cow burps and farts, refrigerants from heat pumps, and nitrous oxide emissions from soil management. We actually first mapped the energy crisis, so let's address those 87%, the big whack of our emissions, in the 1970s, when the oil crisis hit the US and 15% of its energy supply was cut off by the Arab oil embargo. That landed on Richard Nixon's desk. There was no EPA at that point. There was no Department of Energy. There was no Energy Information Administration. All of these things came into existence between Nixon, who started it, and Carter. The very first time we mapped it, they had to invent a way to think about the energy crisis. In fact, the first task for mapping it went to the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy. At that time, America was very bullish on atomic energy, and it was a Senate Committee on Atomic Energy that was tasked with figuring out, well, what's this energy crisis we're facing? And so they were the first to build this Sankey diagram, as it's known, of how does energy flow through the US economy. So on the left-hand side, these are the inputs of energy. In this case, it was 1976. It was nuclear, natural gas, coal, and oil. And then they flow into the sectors, which we still use the same sectors today to talk about energy flows: the electricity sector, residential, industrial, commercial, and transportation sector. This is the same picture from 2020. The joke amongst energy nerds is that nothing really changed in 50 years of American energy policy apart from the color scheme. So you can still see that we have the same sectors. In fact, the proportion of waste to useful energy, the red cross being waste and green being useful end use energy, actually went down a little bit over those 50 years. So we're not doing terribly well. Really, all that we learned from the 70s, and you will now this will feel familiar to you, is that waste is bad and efficiency is good. This, in fact, gave us modern American energy policy. It gave us efficiency as policy. That translated to the CAFE fuel standards, which drive the fuel efficiency of many of the world's vehicles. And that gave us the Energy Star appliance ratings. The theory being that if all vehicles on American roads used 15% less oil, and if all heating systems and appliances use 15% less energy, that the US could overcome this 15% shortfall due to the energy crisis. But that 20th century energy crisis is very different to the climate crisis, which we have today, because you can't efficiency our way to zero if we wish to maintain our modern lifestyles. So we're stuck in old ways of thinking. In 2018, the other thing I didn't mention in my introduction, so my day job is building energy companies. My night job is doing energy advocacy, not profit work, and my hobby has for many years been energy data. So I won't zoom in on the specifics, but we did a remapping of the US energy flow in 2018 in partnership with the Department of Energy, looking at every energy flow through the US economy in as much detail as you could determine from readily available data. We actually mapped all of the energy flows to about 0.1%. In an abstract sense, you can see it. The US total energy flow is measured in quads, which is an absurd historic unit. It's quadrillions of British thermal units. The units don't really matter. It's just easier to think about it in percentages. So anytime I say 1 quad, you can think of that as 1% of the roughly 100 quads that the US uses. The sectors that we measure are the government sector. Unusually, half of the energy used in the government sector, this is basically its petrol, its gasoline bills and its electricity bills. And close to half of it is actually jet fuel for the Department of Defense. That's the largest consumer in the government sector. This is really just to show that we've done all the homework. This is the residential sector. The largest consumer in the residential sector is our space heating, but you can break this up into multifamily homes, single family homes, the whole thing. This is the commercial sector, where we can break it down right down to what we use in food sales, what we use in offices, what we use in schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And quite incredible detail in transportation sector, down to the 0.6% of energy we use in driving children to school, the close to 1% of US energy flow, which is using natural gas to pump natural gas through US pipelines. And here is the industrial energy flows, where you find out that 0.2% of US energy flow is used in abattoirs for the meat industry. So you can get actually quite incredible detail about how we use energy. The reason we did this, of course, was to map out how do you transform all of these sectors to get to zero emissions. It really gave me this mechanistic machine level view of all of the energy flows in the US, because you have to think about, well, how do we decarbonize this sector or that sector? And once you've come to peace with the fact that we can only run a small portion, perhaps 5 to 10% in a very ambitious scenario of the US energy economy on biofuels, there simply won't be enough negative emissions to offset significant portions of this. You start to realize that the only possible way that we will get to zero emissions is through electrification of nearly all of these machines. I've then come to think about the challenge in terms of two types of machines. The supply side, this is the small number of machines that last about 50 years. These are the coal plants, the LNG loading facilities. These are the natural gas pipelines. These are the oil refineries. There's about 1 million of those pieces of large energy infrastructure that supply all of our energy. And that has traditionally been the domain of the conversation about how do we decarbonize. But I think it's incredibly important and liberating to think about the demand side. This is a literally huge number of the small machines that we experience in our everyday lives that last about 25 years. There's about 1 billion of those machines. Climate policy historically lived on the supply side. There's large corporations and their lobby groups to represent that. But Americans, and in fact, you can abstract this to any country in the world you're sitting in, the decisions that determine our quality of lives, the cost of our energy, and the majority of our emissions as everyday people live on the demand side. This is to argue for making demand side electrification a big component of energy policy. There it is again, this machine level view. And why do that machine level view? This is actually arguing for how we have to think about all of those machines in our everyday lives in terms of this global energy transition. This is from today's IPCC report. These are the what they call emissions trajectories, that we have to go from 40 gigatons of CO2, where I'm circling the mouse there, and we need to go down one of these blue emissions trajectories to get to zero emissions by 2050, in order, and actually negative after that, in order to stay on target for the 1.5 degree world we need. You can see this is the origin of the 50% or more reductions in emissions that we need to see by 2030. Fast and early emission reductions are vital. So if we can go faster here instead of following this great path, then we don't need to do these huge amount of negative emissions later this century, which are really actually unrealistic. But to bring it back to the machines in our lives and the machines that you're all working on and that your customers work on, I like to think about the first 3/4 of this curve. This is the emissions that we know how to today eliminate through electrification. The last quarter are those emissions that we mentioned earlier in agriculture, in refrigerants, in cement and steel making. We still are developing those technologies, but here the first 3/4 is what we know how to do today. And to stay on those trajectories, you can see roughly what we need to do in our households, in our communities, to hit those targets. To emphasize it, and everyone, a lot of you will realize this intuitively, you design machines, they don't last forever. In fact, water heaters in the US, we know, and kitchen cooking appliances last 10 to 12 years. Space heaters last about 15 years. Cars last about 20 years. So in fact, to hit our climate targets at this point, we need to pretty much get into the mindset of every time any one of these machines retires in our life, we need to replace it with a zero emission electric machine. In fact, this blue line, the green line, the purple line, these are the adoption curves if we make sure that we are every single purchase of a vehicle, this is the best we can do, if you like, if we're replacing machines at their natural rate of replacement. There they are again, the critical machines in the average American household, and although really this picture is equally true in most of Western Europe, in Australia, in most of the world. We've got to figure out how to replace all of the machines that are using fossil fuels over the next couple of decades. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound like the most substantive part of the emissions spectrum. It actually is. 42% of the emissions in the US emanate, and it's the same number in Australia, emanate from decisions that are made around the kitchen table. That is, what fuels your car, what heats your home, where does the electricity come from, and how are those fuels made? In fact, if you also believe that small businesses make their decisions around the kitchen table, that is actually about 65% of emissions, because most small businesses have very similar loads. It's their water heating loads, it's their thermal loads, and it's the energy that goes to driving the small businesses' vehicles. So getting to zero emissions requires electrifying the demand side machines, supplying clean electricity. This is meant to be clear messaging. Demand side machines are like this. The average American home has 1.9 vehicles, so I should have cut the tail end off that F-150 there. They need to be electrified. Electrify with a heat pump, the water heater, the space heater, kitchen appliances. We should be putting as much solar as we can on their roof. And I'll give you an anecdote about Australia. The cheapest electricity delivered to end consumers anywhere in the world is rooftop solar in Australia. We've eliminated the soft costs and the regulatory barriers. And in fact, it's delivering electricity in Australia after financing at 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. That's about half of the price that the average American pays for electricity from their grid. To enable that electrification, we also need to upgrade the main panel, and we probably need to add a battery to the side of the house. On the supply side, we need wind, we need solar, we need hydroelectricity. In North America, you probably don't technically need nuclear, but I think North America will benefit from using some nuclear. In Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe, almost certainly there needs to be nuclear added to this mix to make the system work out. So very quickly, one of the big cases for electrifying everything is just the monumental, we spent 50 years with this efficiency mindset born of the scarcity of the oil crisis in the 70s, but it really didn't change our efficiency very much, only by a couple of percentage points. The real case for electrifying everything is just how efficient these machines are. As a cartoon, although the cartoons are accurate, if you took America's favorite car, the Ford F-150, running on gasoline or diesel, you can make it slightly more efficient, which is what we've done in the past 50 years. However, the F-150 Lightning will run on less than 1/3 of the primary energy of the petrol equivalent. Similar story with natural gas water heaters on the left. You can make them slightly more efficient, but if we go to heat pump water heaters in nearly every climate zone in the US, they will use 1/3 of the energy required for the natural gas. Same when we look at natural gas furnaces, we're moving the heat pumps about 1/3 of the energy. Even with cooking, from going from natural gas to induction or even electric resistance, you lower the amount of energy for cooking by about 50%. The biggest win of all, of course, is in the way we produce the electricity. Traditional thermoelectric power plants like our coal and natural gas in America, actually the average efficiency of those fossil fuel fleet is about 38%. That means 62% of the energy that you put in the front end of that machine goes up the smokestack as waste heat. When we generate the same amount of electricity with wind and solar, there's negligible losses to heat, and so we eliminate that primary energy also. So the quite amazing statistic is, without shrinking the size of the American household, without shrinking our cars, with none of what we traditionally thought of as efficiency measures, just by electrification of all of these demand side machines, you more than halve the amount of energy that the US economy needs to run itself. That's the power of plugging in. Again, back to my machine level view of the world, let me just run you through what I think hopefully should get you excited as a business. Here's the task ahead just for America, and then you can imagine the task for the world. So this is thinking about all of the machines from the appliances up through the switchboard into the house, up to street level, up to suburb level, up through the distribution level to substations, all the way out to the grid. And let's think about all of the machines that we need to replace. There's 121 million households in the US. You can see they break down by different types, but they all have very similar machines inside them. There's still close to 60 million natural gas heaters in US households, 6 million fuel oil and kerosene heaters, the most expensive way to heat your house of all. Still 6 million propane heaters also in the US, 60 million gas water heaters, 20 million gas dryers, 35 million gas stoves, 7 million gas cooktops, 2 million gas ovens, 2 million fossil fueled hot tubs, 1.5 million fossil fueled heated swimming pools, and about 70 million fossil powered barbecues in the US. That's not to include our vehicles, which is 220 million household vehicles in the US. Quarter of them are cars, 50% now are SUVs, 20% are pickup trucks, 5% are minivans, 8.5 million motorcycles that are also need to be electrified. To do all of that electrification, that's about 500 million machines. We're going to need new household infrastructure. That'll mean at least one vehicle charger per vehicle, upgrading all of the load centers. That's 100 million of those, at least 30 million household batteries to help balance the electrical system, at least 50 million rooftop solar installations. That's another 400 million enabling machines. When you add them all up, here's either a scary statistic or something that should excite you as a business. There's 1 billion machines on the demand side that we need to install in the next 20 years to hit our climate targets. Remember that we're going to build these billion machines anyway. We just need to make sure that we're building them electrically. That's a million machines installed per week for the next 20 years, or half a million households every month for the next 20 years that we need to completely electrify. That's millions of jobs in construction, installation, local jobs. It's jobs in manufacturing, finance, and sales. This is going to be possibly could be the largest job creator that the US has seen since World War II. That's not to mention the toys. I understand that you're all not that we should call these toys, but there are a whole lot of other machines that use fossil fuels that are now being electrified very, very rapidly. And that represents probably another 250 million machines in the US alone. So reason enough to do it is for climate, but here's actually a very optimistic story. Part of what I do for governments is I help them model the costs of this energy transition. So to put it into context of a family, this on the right is the average household spending for an average US family. After tax, they spend $61,000 a year. Currently, they spend about $2,000 a year on gasoline, which is more than they spend on fresh meat and vegetables. They spend $1,500 a year on electricity, which is more than they spend on education. And they spend about $500 a year on heating fuels, which is more than they spend on dentistry. For the wealthiest 10% of homes, that's about 3 or 4% of their household income. But for the bottom 50% on the income spectrum, it's closer to 10% or more of their monthly income, and a very significant burden. Here's the future we can look forward to. This is a little bit of a complicated slide, so I'll tease this one out for you a little bit. Really, the future has arrived. It's just not actually happening in any one place in the world. So I mentioned to you the Australian, they call it down here, the Australian rooftop solar miracle. Solar installs here at $1 a watt. After financing, that makes electricity for you at 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. For context, in the US, it still installs on average at over $3 a watt, which is why it's sort of marginal or slightly more expensive than the grid delivered electricity. So Australia has got the rooftop solar right. Countries like South Korea and Japan are doing delivered heat at around 3 cents a kilowatt hour due to the extraordinary efficiency of the heat pumps they're doing. So we have that going right in that part of the world. We know that batteries have dropped in price incredibly in the last decade. I remember buying wholesale packs at $1,200 a kilowatt hour in 2010. I'm now paying $140 to $160 a kilowatt hour for wholesale packs. And we know that there's a pathway to, I think, $75 a kilowatt hour is the projected price in 2025. So that's coming down the pipeline. That's happening all over the world. We know everywhere in the world that wind and solar industrial is feeding into the grid at 3-4 cents per kilowatt hour. And the thing that America is doing incredibly well is getting electric vehicles to cost parity with gasoline vehicles. Today, we conceive of electric vehicles as $10,000 or $20,000 more expensive than their gasoline equivalent. But Lazards, Bloomberg New Energy, and others are seeing that won't be true. By about 2025 or 2026, the electric vehicle will be cheaper in the showroom than the gasoline vehicle. So when we can make those 5 things happen in the same one country or the same one state, you will see the astounding thing happening, provided that we've electrified all of those end-use machines. The average American household would be saving about $2,500 a year. That's an economy-wide savings of $300 billion a year. This is actually why I have some optimism that we can address this climate challenge and we can address it quickly, because we're right on the cusp of the economics really, really working and driving this faster than we've ever expected it before. I'm going to finish there. I don't know how close I went to the time I promised, but I promise you as many answers as you want. I'm Saul Griffith. I hope you're going to help me electrify everything in the world and help families save money, and help us all address this critical climate crisis that we have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Saul. It was excellent. Really helpful context to a lot of things that we're all seeing. Just going to remind everybody that we've got Saul for the next up to 30 minutes for questions. So if you have any burning questions, just pop that into the Q&A. I'll start. The first question I had was, not to be cute, Saul, but maybe share with us, do you have an electric car? And if so, what type?
I'm on to my fifth. Right now I have a Nissan makes the Nissan Leaf in the North American market. In Japan, they made a soccer mum van out of the Nissan Leaf. It's perhaps the ugliest production vehicle ever made, but it has 2 sliding doors. You can throw the dogs, the children, the groceries in. You can hose it all out when you're finished. And my wife and I, in spite of its ugliness, absolutely love it. Probably more where you were going and might be more interested. I'm actually kind of a car nerd, and I'm electrifying all of my vintage vehicles. I own 4 vintage cars that are all at least 55 years old. I just finished electrifying my 1957 Fiat Multipla, which is a tiny little 6-seat bus that used to be a taxi in Italy. I was maybe the second or third person in line to buy the electric Ford E-Crate motor at its release at SEMA, which is a sort of hot rod show in Vegas this year. And I'm going to use that to electrify my 1961 Lincoln Continental, which I'm looking forward to. And then I'm hopefully, if those projects get past my wife, I'll then electrify my 59 Volkswagen Dune buggy and 1963 Land Rover.
Nice. That sounds awesome. I know Klaus, he's ordered I'm driving a gas BMW, but Klaus has got his i4 on order and he's waiting patiently for them to build it. So he's going electric.
The supply chain problem is real in that world right now.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, we're seeing it on our side too. Another question that that the bulk of people watching are either from original equipment manufacturers. We're mostly from your presentation, the toys, vehicles, not big auto, but light vehicles and industrial machines and material handling. We're seeing what I would characterize for our business as explosive growth the last couple of years, to the point where, it makes sense to us, but we continue to scratch our heads and say, what's really driving all of this? Maybe a silly question, but could you add some context, do you think, what's driving our industrial businesses?
I would love my answer to you to be a concern for climate. I don't think that's actually driving it. I think really in nearly every market for nearly every application, electrified end use, the economics now wins against natural gas, wins against compressed air. And that's just for the combination of the price cuts in electricity that are happening around the world because of the low maintenance of electric motors, all of the advantages that I'm sure you're selling in those markets. But really the biggest driver of all is that batteries have arrived. Somewhere in the last 5 years, they really got to a price point where you can imagine putting batteries in all sorts of applications. And I think that's driving, especially in micro mobility, in all of this, there's like a Cambrian explosion in small light electric vehicles, whether it's jet skis or e-mobility solutions or golf carts. I know that we as a company are or we're actually just building a company right now, which is looking at batteries that cross the threshold where you could incorporate them into end-use appliances in the kitchen that will help eliminate natural gas from the kitchen, because by putting $200 or $300 worth of batteries into the cooktop, you eliminate the $2,000 or $3,000 worth of labor to run a dedicated high current circuit across the house, which is typically, for some of you might have tried to electrify your kitchens. It's those soft costs are a problem. But anyway, I think people are able to see batteries driving end use electrification, and I'm sure you're benefiting, battery management systems, electric motors, all of the things that are following in the wake of that battery revolution.
That makes sense. Thank you. I've got a question here from, I've got a number of questions. This is a question from Yanni Laksinen. He's asking about geothermal as a specific technology used for heating and cooling in the house. Do you have any comments that didn't come up in your presentation, or how big a role that could play?
Geothermal is a fabulous technology, and it's just expensive, sadly, in most places, and difficult to install. So for those people, it's there's two types of geothermal that people think about. One of the geothermals is the heat deep in the earth that can be used to create electricity, and then the other is geothermal heating for buildings. That's actually where you take the sun heats the earth year round. And in fact, if you dig down about 3 or 4 feet anywhere in North America, you'll likely find the temperature of the ground there is a constant, roughly 50 to 60 degrees all through the year. Putting loops of water that you use as a heat exchanger in that ground is what's known as geothermal heat. And then you can use a small auxiliary heat pump to heat that up to heat your house. They're very, very efficient systems. The problem is that heat exchanger needs to be huge. You often need to have what amounts to an oil drilling rig come to your house to drill down to access it. So while I think, there's companies like Dandelion Energy in the US that are doing it in the Northeast, where customers have big enough yards and can afford the upfront cost, but actually the straight up performance of what's called air source heat pumps, that's the competitor, that instead of using the ground for the source of the heat, they pull heat out of the air. They're getting efficient enough that they're cost competitive in nearly every market. So as I like to say, yes, and there will also be geothermal systems, but if you were betting on which one will win the majority of the market, it looks like air source. Although there is an intriguing idea, if you like new ideas now, where we could take the existing natural gas network, which runs a pipe to everyone's home, and actually pump water through that as a giant collective geothermal system that then people could tap the warm water off and use heat pumps and heat their house from that. I think that's quite a good idea, and that might be quite popular in Europe, where they're more used to those sort of networked urban systems for heat.
Thank you. Another one here, just a little bit different question, and I think it's a good one. It's from Alistair Johnson. Why do you think that many governments still portray the transition that you've articulated to all things electric as a cost, as opposed to an economic opportunity, which you did well here today? Why is the narrative this way, in your opinion?
I think there is a very, full disclosure, I offered the same services to the last Republican government, but they were refused. But so help on this transition, and I've been working with the Democratic government in the US, and in working on it this year, I've seen just how strong the lobbying groups, namely, really the big heavy hitter in Washington at the moment is the American Gas Association, that's desperately trying to protect its turf. It can see this future coming. It doesn't like it, and is spending enormous amount of monies on still trying to sell you the idea of the clean blue flame, even though that clean blue flame gives your children asthma. They're selling the idea that they use they use tricks in how they do the accounting to try and show that natural gas is cheaper for heating. That is true in a few remaining industries that use huge quantities, but I think we just ran the economics. This was before Putin going into Ukraine, and I think it was 88% of American households would save money on electrifying their heating systems today compared to natural gas. After the Ukraine has spiked the natural gas prices, it's probably much closer, even more in the mid 90%. So I think the real answer to that question is a little bit, all of this technology is so new that the politicians are trying to figure out how to talk about it. The best politician in the US on these issues is Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. He's actually an engineer. Unsurprisingly, he understands what's going on as an engineer does. He sees the efficiency of these machines. He's doing a good job, but there's not a lot. And so I think there's also a little bit of the history of the environmentalist movement has struggled for so long to sell this idea that if we work really hard and we sacrifice an enormous amount, we'll just maybe get to 100%, as opposed to, you know what, this is going to be the cheapest energy we've ever had anywhere in the world, and the opportunity is big. I think part of the reason America is struggling is that they haven't yet had this incredible experience that Australia has. 50% of Australian households in many jurisdictions have solar on their roof because it is so cheap. It costs 72 cents on average per watt to sell for the sales and marketing to sell solar in the US. Because it's more expensive than the grid, it costs a huge amount to sell it. And really, that's why it only has penetration on 2-3% of households. In Australia, where it's so cheap, you sell it over the back fence because your neighbor says, well, how's your solar doing? And it's so cheap that it's only cost 1 or 2 cents is the cost of sale in Australia. I think it probably won't be solar. So it's purely a regulatory reason in America, that it's a regulatory own goal that is preventing that. So I'm not sure that cheap solar will be the horse that electrification rides in on in the US. I think it'll be cheap electric cars. It'll be the coming electric SUVs. Round figures, if you drive a gasoline F-150, it's costing you 10 to 20 cents a mile. If you drive an electric version of the same truck, it's going to cost you 3 or 4 cents a mile. And so I think that will start to change the narrative in the US. I think hopefully soon. It still frustrates me that political parties of all stripes in the US, when they say climate change, they wince and they look like they're saying this is going to be really hard, and they're yet to seize on this giant economic opportunity.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you. That's good context. By the way, I realize I said I had you till 7 or for another 15 minutes. I realize that's not the case. But can you allow me?
I can do a few more questions. They're good questions.
Thank you. Got a question here from Ravinder Khalsa. His point is the solutions that you talk about seem plausible for developed economies in North America, in Europe. But what specific recommendations do you have to tackle this crisis in developing economies?
If you looked at the 2 countries that did the most per capita installation of solar last year in the world, it's Indonesia and Vietnam. Of motor scooters sold in the world, which is the majority of transportation solutions in a lot of the markets that these developing economies, I think it was 76% or more of the motor scooters made in the world last year were electric. So in some respects, because of the economics, these solutions, I think, are going to take off faster in developed markets than they do in some of the developed markets of the world. So I see very encouraging things happening if you sort of read between the headlines, happening in Southeast Asia, happening in Africa, where you can see something like the cell phone revolution that happened in those countries where they skipped landlines and went straight to cell phones, and they're happier for it. I think we'll see skipping a few of the fossil fuel generations of technologies and going straight to electric in a lot of those markets.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we certainly see demand coming out of India. That's a lot of interest in projects, OEM projects, in not just India, but that's been a hotspot for us recently.
It was amazing. I've been working on a electric motorbike project, and then we had a fabulous, quite famous American designer, and he was just poached away from us to go and work for India's largest manufacturer of motorcycles and scooters to do their electrification. So, it's happening.
Yeah, that's a market we're definitely involved in, but we're not quite sure if it's going to grow to the extent that the government is suggesting it is. There's a big push, but the trouble for business sometimes is, when do we step in and how much do we invest? But the
COVID blip and the Ukraine blip have really slowed this down a little bit in the last 18 months. Basically, the supply chain problems have really hit, and you can see, curiously, battery prices have started to go up for the first time. That is temporary. So there's a supply chain problem. We underinvested in lithium reserves. That's being solved now, and in fact, in both Australia and in North America, very significant resources have been found that will help that, but that's 2 or 3 years away. So I actually think what's going to slow this down a little bit is just getting to scale. So I think I'd use that in caution for rushing in. The other big challenge, of course, that was maybe in that question about developed countries, it's also in low income households. As many of you know, some of these electric solutions you have to sell on the ongoing operating costs, and they're definitely cheaper machines to operate because of the energy costs ongoing and also the lower maintenance. But for low-income households, in particular in the supplies developing nations, that means you need well-developed credit and financing systems in order to help households buy the electric vehicle, buy the electric upgrades. And I think that's going to be another throttling item on this. So even though the economics of that electric car are a slam dunk in operational costs, getting low-income households to be able to afford the upfront cost is going to be a challenge.
One more question?
Yeah, I see a bunch of good questions. Let's just go to the top of the hour.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very generously. Okay, so Edward Lopez, his point is that electrifying everything is a feasible solution. We can see the technology. But what are your thoughts about the trade-offs of batteries coming into the market and going to end of life from a environmental impact trade-off point of view?
This is an underappreciated good news story that is currently being used as a bad news story, and probably this is the second or third question I get. And the other question is, in any public setting, it's also, what are we going to do with all the wind turbines? What are we going to do with all the solar cells? So I think it's useful to ask this question in terms of, well, what do we do today? For the average American lifestyle, you're burning around 12 to 15,000 pounds of fossil fuels a year. They go immediately into the atmosphere as waste, and they become 30 to 40,000 pounds of CO2 per person. If you look at all of those energy flows and you figure out how to put the electric vehicles in everyone's life, and you do all the math, to supply the same lifestyle to the same American with the same size car, the same size house, but do it all electrically, you're going to need about 100 pounds of wind turbines per year per person, 100 pounds of solar cells per year per person. This is assuming that wind turbines last about 30 years, solar cells last about 20 years, and you'll need about 100 pounds a year of batteries if you're going to store roughly half of that electricity in batteries, which is likely a true enough estimate. And those batteries last around 10 years. So that's around 300 pounds of stuff compared to 30,000 pounds of stuff at end of life. That's quite a substantially decreased burden. But my original degree was in metallurgical engineering, and my first job was in a steel mill, and my second job was in an aluminum smelter. And in both of those settings, the majority of the feedstock for making steel and aluminium in the world is recycled. And in fact, the majority of the materials we need for these batteries, for these solar cells, for these wind turbines are very highly recyclable metals. And you could imagine 75 or 80% of the content being recycled. This is what we should be aspiring to. And then that 300 pounds a year goes down to 20 or 30 or 40 pounds a year per person. And I actually think that this is our best pathway to the circular economy that we imagine, and honestly looks like a much better option for humans than the burn it and forget it thing that we're doing right now.
Excellent.
But we do have to emphasize, that recycling, and particularly with batteries. How do we safely do that at end of life? How do we design for disassembly? I think that's going to be a very important thing, especially around the battery packs.
Yeah, thanks. That is a question that comes up, and it seems to be a narrative sort of that people throw up as a way to kind of, steer away, or not steer away, but to kind of say maybe this isn't such a panacea that we're thinking it is. But I appreciate
it's not perfect, and we should always be careful that we could solve climate change yet still choke the oceans with plastic. Right? We are a flawed being, but at least there is space for optimism that this is an improvement over what we do today.
Last question. It's from Luke Bohr. He says, Saul, you say electric cars will be an equivalent price to internal combustion vehicles by around 2026, I think, from your presentation. Is that without government subsidies, or?
That is the projection without government subsidies in North America, as projected by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who are in the business of doing this. You can certainly imagine once we can install the battery packs, including the power management, for around $100 a kilowatt hour, which is also, again, projected 2024, 2025, that will be true. The solar prices I quote in Australia are not subsidized. That's the unsubsidized price. After the subsidies in Australia for solar, it's actually about 80 cents a watt. So I actually think that all of the technologies will get there unsubsidized on the merit. It will still, however, be a big upfront sort of credit problem for many people to participate. So it'll go from being a cash problem to, do you have credit access problem? So I'm pretty optimistic on the prices. I think I think these models probably all got set back 12 to 18 months through a combination of COVID, the supply chain crisis, and the Ukraine crisis. So it might be 2027 now, but a friend of mine just took delivery of a Rivian. It has 180 kilowatt hour battery pack and costs $73,000. In Australia, if you buy a Tesla Powerwall, it's a 13 kilowatt hour battery pack, and it costs $16,000. So the Rivian is like 1/3 the price of the Tesla home battery, but it comes with a free truck. And I think that tells you where the trend is going.
Well, yeah, in Canada, we're starting to see electric vehicles, Ioniq 5, and the Kia version of that platform EV6 selling for, I'm just starting to see them around here for the low 50s, 50,000 Canadian. So it's getting better. It used to be, people used to assume you had to spend 100,000 to get a Model S, or, you know, what the original.
My sister just bought one of those. She loves it. I just, Tesla loaned me a car to do my book tour in Australia. I put 6,000 miles on it in 2 weeks. Had no problem charging it across the country. There are superchargers everywhere. You can see now it doesn't require imagination anymore. You can live the experience. It's a better experience than what we're doing. It really does feel like it's happening finally. Again, however, it's not happening everywhere. It's like America and Norway are doing the cars right, and Australia is doing the solar. Like, we just got to get these things to happen all in the same place.
Excellent. Well, Saul, I really appreciate your presentation, and it's really helpful to have this context for everybody in our conference. Did you want to mention your book again?
You're very kind. You know, honestly, it's not. I'm not really an author. I'm an engineer. I wrote this book as essentially a policy guide for the incoming president. I wrote it in 2019. There's an Australian election in 6 weeks. I wrote this as a policy guide for what's possible, because I think people are attracted to a positive narrative finally, after 20 years of a depressing narrative on climate change. I think people are ready for action. I think that's why it's interesting to frame it in terms of the household. It's interesting to frame it in terms of household economics. So if I'd love you to buy it, but this was written for Joe Biden, and this is written for, we don't know who's going to be the Prime Minister in Australia.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And again, kudos to you. Great presentation. Still struggling with COVID. So thank you.
I'll leave you all with a cough. Thanks, and thanks for the good questions.
Cheers. Thank you.